Yanmas Taldor, Moon Day, on the first week of autumn, 4718. It was mid-afternoon on Moon Day of their first week in Yanmas, by the time the party left the Commerce Hall to begin their investigation. Earlier that morning, Marius had told the council at the council meeting and their Pytheria-sponsored rivals, led by the contemptible Earl Yander Mercandus, that they would solve all of Yanmas's problems, including the Plague of Dreams, the arrival of a new mysterious cult, and the disappearance of the city's large stationed cavalry regiments, plus a subsequent rise in banditry in the city's surrounding hinterlands, all by week's end. It was a bold claim, but the party were mustering themselves up for the challenge. The core team who were exiting the Commerce Hall now consisted of astute wizard and baron Aurelius Betnos, his close childhood friend, Lord Diyanah Frascati, a monk of Irori and master of the deadly dragon style, who was now rather appropriately wearing a shimmering cloak of golden dragon scale, the burly half-orc barkeep and skilled brawler Marius, the Numerian android and experienced bard Demetria, and finally a man who presented himself as Baron Aurelius's valet, Willem, but who was in fact a shape-shifting dark elf oracle named Rankle. They were supported by some allies of theirs who were staying at another inn on the other side of town, the druid Anmel Oakleaf, the cleric of Hansberg Gerta Thresh, and the young witch Lady Sepsinia Crabby. After the council meeting, Aurelius, Diyanah, Demi, Marius, and Rankle took a narrow flight of steps down from Commerce Hall to the north side of Gentry Hill. Here they weren't far from their inn, the Gilded Baldaquin. Then, after purchasing a quick bite to eat at a local cafe, Rankle cast a sending spell to inform the secondary team what had transpired. By this time they had various leads to follow up on: the meeting invitation at the Church of Abadar, searching for a possible defector near Hedge Hill, the interviewing of a private citizen named Miss Farkin, and the investigation of the Savories Restaurant. "We're heading over to the Church of Abadar now," Rankle had told Gerta via his oracular powers. "We received a private meeting request from the High Priest, and plan to speak to him there right away. Meet us at the church when you can, and we'll bring you all up to speed." The cobblestone streets in this area bustled with life, and the party had to weave their way through the throngs of merchants, labourers, and townsfolk. The din of voices being raised, the clattering of hooves, and the rhythmic creak of wooden carts echoed off the surrounding buildings. Crossing around a building under construction, they turned down a narrow side alley, and here the noise of the city dimmed slightly. Halfway down the path, figures emerged from the shadows ahead, stepping out from behind a cluster of barrels and crates. They were gaunt, their faces pale and drawn, eyes hollow with a desperate, haunted look. They drew short but well-sharpened knives, poor weapons by military standards, but deadly enough in a street brawl. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, and as they turned quickly, they saw more figures closing in, cutting off their retreat. Aurelius's fingers reflexively made the arcane symbols for a detect magic spell. These were not thieves that were about to accost them. The lingering aura of a mind-affecting enchantment spell lay upon them. Aurelius needed only a moment to identify it as a Lesser Gaius spell, a magical command that could be used to make the weak-willed carry out some service. "Don't kill them," said Aurelius. "They're not themselves. They're under some kind of enchantment." The ambushers rushed forward, knives flashing through the air. Fortunately, the party's warriors were particularly skilled at disarming and incapacitating untrained foes. They stepped around Aurelius to keep the wizard out of the fight. Demi drew her rapier rather than her crossbow, mostly to parry any attacks made against her. Rankle drew his brand-new sky metal blade to do the same. Marius and Diyanah went unarmed, jinking out of the way of the knives, and delivering powerful but non-lethal blows to the ensorcelled labourers. Those that Marius and Diyanah did not knock out, Demi dropped to the floor with a sleep spell. The fight was quickly over. Diyanah tied up one of the men with his new iron rope, and then hardened it fast, so that he would not be able to escape or break the restraints. Demi splashed some water on his face from her water skin to wake him up. "Why did you accost us?" asked Demi. "To make the nightmare stop," said the man desperately struggling against the iron rope. He was stuck fast. "Why do you think that attacking us would make the dreams end?" she asked. "Because the thing in the dream told us it would," said the man. Marius nodded at Demi. "He's not lying." Marius had been granted a special magical item called the Subtle Mask by the Swan Maid in Marat, and in addition to fading into his face and turning his eyes from their natural brown color to a vivid blue and green color, they also allowed him to detect lies, and on occasions even read a person's mind. "The thing in his dreams, I can see it," said Marius, and he delivered a swift punch to the man to knock him out cold. "It is a great cockroach-like thing, with a disturbingly human face. Did you all see the thing behind Panavar when he teleported away? It looked like that. I'm now fairly confident Panavar, or creatures in the service of Panavar, are the ones causing the nightmares." "I should share some suspicions of my own, then," said Demi. "I've been doing some research as well since our encounter with Panavar. I think the thing behind him was some kind of sakil. Do any of you know what that is?" The companions shook their heads. "Okay," said Demi. "Where to begin, then? When a person dies, their soul is shepherded to the afterlife by these special servants of Phrasma called psychopomps. Millennia ago, some of these psychopomps fell from grace. They became the sakils. They are creatures of raw fear and terror, and they dwell in a hidden place in the ethereal plane, a dimension of nightmares they call Xibalba. They are highly telepathic, and are adept at creating visions of horror and torture." "Well, that sounds delightful," said Diyanah. "Well, we know that some of us experience vivid nightmares at the Palace of Birdsong, and we all saw the creature that Panavar collected from there. We only saw it briefly, I think, because it was shunting out of the ethereal plane, so that it could travel with Panavar to where he was going, maybe here, perhaps. These creatures can freely move between the ethereal plane and the physical universe. While ethereal, they are both invisible and intangible to us. If we're dealing with sakils, they will be extremely difficult to kill." "Huh," noted Diyanah. "Well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, but just know that I may have a way of dealing with things that can hide in the ethereal plane." Demi nodded at him. "Let's keep going," said Aurelius. "I think we've learned all we can here." Beyond the alley, the thoroughfare led down into the valley, and the site of the Temple of Abadar came into view, its soaring roof dominating the skyline, despite being situated in the lower part of the city. The temple was a marvel of architecture, its airy and elegant design standing in stark contrast to the surrounding buildings, the golden hue of the stone quarried from the fog peaks giving it a radiant glow, even in the muted light of the overcast sky. Its 6 high spires, each rising from one of the vertices of the L-shaped building, reached towards the heavens. The stained glass windows, illustrated to tell stories of commerce, law, and civilization. Atop the tallest towers, key-shaped chimes swayed gently in the breeze, their soft melodic tones occasionally drifting down to the streets below. At the base of the temple, several steps led up to open double doors. Massive columns supported a mighty awning, each one etched with the symbols of Abadar's faith, keys, scales, and coins. The doors themselves were flanked by statues of armored figures, their stern gazes cast downwards to those coming in. The doors themselves were immense, crafted from dark wood and reinforced with gilded metal. Inside, the temple was just as impressive, a vast hall lined with golden mosaics, the altars overflowing with offerings from the city's merchants, with countless relics displayed in alcoves and on plinths. At the end of the hall, Chief Enumerator Abron Palliator was speaking to one of his acolytes when he spotted Aurelius's party coming in. He quickly tasked the acolyte to see to the needs of the faithful who had gathered in the pews, and then he called Aurelius over. "Come, my friends, follow me," he said. "I'd have words with you in private." He escorted them past some temple guards, down a hall, and then into a long, narrow meeting room. The room was largely undecorated, but its ceilings were as impressively high as in the rest of the building, and it had a long table running down the middle of it, surrounded by simple wooden chairs. At the end of the room was a single embellishment, a statue of the Lawgiver, a mighty warrior clad in plate armor, who famously carries a golden hammer and serves as Abadar's herald, or chief servant, in his divine domain on the plane of Axis. The enumerator was clearly worried about prying eyes and ears, because he pulled no fewer than 2 latches on the door, and he glanced around nervously before he finally sat down at the table. "So tell us, enumerator," said Aurelius, sitting next to him, "what had you so worried you didn't want to say anything at the council meeting?" Marius, Diyanah, and Demi pulled up close as well. Rankle, or Willem, as he went by in his human guise, kept an appropriate distance, as would be customary for a lord's valet. "It's about the leader of the cult," said the enumerator. "He's not human, you see." No sooner were these words out of his mouth, and a crossbow bolt suddenly appeared in his chest. The chief enumerator gasped a dying breath. A second bolt followed, but Demi put an arm out in the way. The bolt pierced her synthetic forelimb, and went out about half an inch on the other side, but she had protected the high priest from the second bolt. Looking up at the high ceilings, there was a figure reloading a crossbow in the rafters. Rankle raced over to the high priest. He needed to reach him to heal him before he breathed his last. Marius and Diyanah flipped the table, and Demi had torn the bolt out of her arm, grabbing the high priest and pulling him into cover. As she did so, she began to sing. Aurelius, thinking quickly, cast a grease spell on the assassin in the rafters. The assassin slipped and tumbled down the over 20 feet between the high rafters and the floor, and landed with not one, but strangely 2 subsequent thuds. Aurelius looked over and noted a shimmer in the light near the assassin. "There's more of them," shouted Aurelius. "They're under the effects of an invisibility spell." Demi reacted by blasting the rafters with a glitter dust spell, and suddenly the outline of no fewer than 6 assassins could be clearly seen above. They were fortunately coughing and choking as the glittering dust blinded them. Diyanah was once again happy he had purchased those boots of spider climbing. He raced up the sides of the walls, and soon he was up in the rafters, closing the distance with the crossbow-wielding assassins. Marius leapt over the cover, closing the gap between the table and the 2 assassins that Aurelius had dropped to the floor with a grease spell. Prone as they were, Marius made short work of them. Rankle had reached the high priest and was healing him. Thankfully he had gotten to him in time. Unless the assassins got another shot off, the priest would survive. Demi's relic crossbow was in her hand, and she was happily kneecapping the dazed and startled assassins above that Diyanah hadn't reached yet with his spider-climbing antics. It looked as though one last assassin was going to get another shot at the priest, but suddenly Aurelius's raven familiar Rodrigo was in his face, squawking loudly and lunging at him with talon and beak. Before long the assassins had all been killed, except one that Marius had delivered a knockout blow to instead. "Okay, this is getting kind of ridiculous, guys," said Diyanah. "We've only been in Yanmass less than 24 hours, and we've already encountered 2 sets of hired killers. Are we expected to believe Yander is not behind this?" "Let's just make sure High Priest Palliator is all right," suggested Aurelius. Palliator breathed in some ragged breaths, but he was going to be all right. Rankle had already drawn out the arrow and had healed the worst of the wound. Palliator channeled the power of his god into his chest and repaired the rest of the damage. Then, after he took a moment to check he was otherwise okay, he turned to Aurelius again. "I was just about to tell you about Vadragan Pole, the high priest of the Church of Twilight. He's not fully human, he's some kind of Nephilim, possibly of a celestial lineage, as his eyes shine with a silver light. But there's nothing celestial about him. He's a con artist and a liar, and it seems clear to me he sent these assassins to make sure I didn't tell you about him. More and more of my flock each day are being drawn in by him. I don't know how he factors into the rest of the city's problems, but he is a menace, and I'm sure he's involved now more than ever." "Well then, let's go and ask the assassin what he knows," said Marius. Diyanah once again secured the surviving assassin with the magic rope he had acquired from the dark elf tunnels under the town of Jambis. Marius woke him up. "Who sent you?" The man spoke with a wet lisp, because Marius had split open his lip with the punch that had knocked him out. He also seemed to have knocked out a few teeth, but the man complied with the interrogation, even if he was a little difficult to understand. The hired killer explained that they had received their contract from a figure in one of their usual haunts, a seedy tavern called the Grand Uncle, located in the downtrodden Wash district. When Marius asked him to describe the man that had hired them, the killer relayed that their employer was cloaked and hooded, but he had eyes that shined like silver. This, of course, caused Palliator to hold his arms in an expression that more or less said, "I told you so." "Assassins and rogues are rarely paid up front," noted Demi, "because it would be too easy to walk away from a job and keep the money. I assume you had an arrangement to collect the rest of your payment once the job was done." The man nodded. The remainder of the payment was to be collected in 2 days' time, late that evening, back at the Grand Uncle, but only on the condition that the job was done. If the job was not done, they had been informed not to show up, because they would not leave with their lives. "A menacing employer," noted Demi. "I have an idea," said Aurelius, thumbing through his spellbook. "Here we go," he said as he found the page he wanted. "Sculpt corpse," he announced. "A little macabre, but it should do the trick." Aurelius waved a hand over the corpse of one of the assassins. The face shifted under the influence of his magic. Soon enough they were looking at the perfectly accurate face of Chief Enumerator Abron Palliator, staring blankly back at them. "Enumerator Palliator," said Aurelius, "I'm very sorry, but we're going to have to ask you to play dead for a while. We will dress this body in your clothes, we'll collect the rest of the assassins' corpses, then we'll ask you to come with us. Our friends have a room at the Whistling Wyvern where you can lay low for a while. Then in 2 days' time, we'll disguise ourselves as the assassins to collect the second half of the payment at the Grand Uncle. I think it'll be the easiest way for us to get access to their employer." Given the recent attempt on his life, Abron readily agreed to this. In fact, he even suggested a hiding spot for the corpses of the assassins. As a cleric of Abadar, he was well versed in some funerary proceedings, and cast a gentle repose spell that would prevent the corpses from decomposing and attracting the attention of his acolytes. Aurelius's handy prestidigitation spell helped him clean up any blood or signs of a struggle, so they could just walk out of the temple, leaving the fake corpse of Abron behind in Abron's office. My acolytes tend not to disturb me if I'm in my office during the day, but by late evening they'll come to check on me if I haven't emerged. That's when they'll find me, and we'll be long gone by then. Your rival, Yanda, will likely try to pin my murder on you, but there won't be any real evidence. Aurelius thanked the priest profusely for being so helpful in putting their little deception together. Diyanah lent the high priest his hat of disguise. Taking on a very different appearance, Abron left the temple of Abadar with them, leaving the temple in the care of his acolytes as he prepared to go into hiding. Not far from the temple they met Gerta, Enlil, and Sepsinia. True to her word, Gerta had seen to it that Sepsinia had traded out her fine lady's clothes for some boots and leathers that a commoner might wear. Additionally, and rather comically, Sepsinia's pig familiar no longer appeared to be a little pet, but rather a small humanoid pig creature, wearing similar clothes and carrying a short sword at his hip. What's going on here with Miss Piggy?" asked Diyanah. "Well, Gerta was getting me this tough girl from the wrong side of the tracks disguise, and I thought Miss Piggy was looking too cute for the Whistling Wyvern, so I went to the arcane supply store and I taught myself how to cast a spell called Anthropomorphic Animal from a scroll I picked up. I'm now called Pepper the Ferocious," declared Miss Piggy, suddenly able to vocalize and swishing around a short sword rather undexterously. "I'm Sepsinia's bodyguard." "Oh, and she can speak in Taldan now," said Sepsinia delightedly. Gerta rolled her eyes. "You see now what I've been putting up with." "Well, regardless, thanks for joining us," said Aurelius to the three allies from Marat. "We have even more to catch you up on since we last spoke. First, this man with us is High Priest Palliator of the Temple of Abadar, in disguise. He has just survived an attempt on his life, so he's going into hiding. Sepsinia, can you and Pepper Pig here take the High Priest back to the Whistling Wyvern to keep him safe?" "What?" said Sepsinia. "Why am I on babysitting duty? I just left the Wyvern. I have this cool new outfit and attitude, and Miss Piggy has a sword now. I'm ready for a real mission." I know, said Aurelius. "And believe me, this is a real mission. 6 highly trained assassins just tried to kill the priest, so we need you to keep him safe, okay?" "Oh wait, 6 assassins," said Sepsinia, suddenly reconsidering. "Maybe leave me Enlil or Gerta as well, then." "You'll be fine," said Aurelius. "Just keep your head down, and don't let anyone know who Palliator is." "We've got this, Seppo," said Pepper the Ferocious, continuing to swish the sword around. "I'm ready for anything." "I'm not sure I like you suddenly calling me Seppo," chided Sepsinia. Enumerator Palliator gave Aurelius a concerned look. "Are you sure I'll be quite safe with a woman and a talking pig?" "Yes, you'll be fine. You're just spending a couple nights at an inn in the Bountiful District until we find the person who hired your attempted killers. Sepsinia is more capable than she lets on." Sepsinia and Palliator left the party to continue their investigation without them. "From here on, we should split up to cover more ground. Agree?" said Rankle. "Yes, we need one group to go down to question this Caradinna Farkin," suggested Aurelius. "The counselor said she lived in a rough part of the Backhill district. Given the fact that we've been accosted once in an alley already, let's send a tough crew down to speak with her. Then we need another group to go and scope out the restaurant. We don't want to cause trouble there. We just want to have a poke around. It's also a very expensive place, apparently, so let's call it a fancy team over there." Marius, Gerta, and Enlil decided they were the tough crew. Aurelius, Demi, and Rankle decided they were the fancy crew. Diyanah hemmed and hawed. "This is a really tough choice, guys, because I think of myself as tough and fancy." "Oh, come with us," suggested Marius. "We can always use the extra muscle." Diyanah sighed. "Okay, but I want a full report on the restaurant, Aurelius. You know I don't like to miss out on fancy food." Savories Restaurant, Moonday, first week of autumn, 4718. For a popular and expensive restaurant, Aurelius, Demi, and Rankle were surprised to note that Savories Restaurant was actually fairly small. 4 padded booths provided the only seats for diners, but it was well decorated, with the wood of the whole structure dark and embellished with gold leaf. An alcove in the southeast contained the restaurant's main entrance, while another similar alcove to the northeast instead contained a massive, graceful ice sculpture of an eagle in flight. It was late afternoon or early evening when they arrived, and the dinner rush had not yet begun. There were currently only 5 patrons in the restaurant, an elderly married couple, and a trio of wealthy younger aristocrats. As Aurelius opened the main door, a small bell announced his arrival, and a waitress, who had just finished pouring out some wine into the goblets of the elderly couple, came out to meet them. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked. "No, I don't, unfortunately," said Aurelius, "but I see it's still early, and you have a number of tables open." "Well, we do have reservations for those, and we expect to be busier in only a half hour or so." Half an hour is plenty for us. We'll only do a single course, and we eat fast. We'll be in and out. We just heard the food here had to be tried to be believed. The waitress hemmed and hawed. I'm really not supposed to seat anyone without a reservation. Aurelius thought of something else. Well, could you tell the proprietor that Princess Eutropia's delegation has just arrived from Tandak Prefecture, and that we'd like a quick meal before we go on our way? Oh, okay. Yes, let me check, she said, and she made her way down to a back room. Rankle's keen eyes scanned the back as she made her way past a beaded divider. 3 doors lay beyond it, one to a restroom, one that looked like it led to a kitchen, and one to a small office. She went into the office. Shortly afterwards, an oily-haired but impeccably dressed man came out to hobnob with them, introducing himself as Argentus, the proprietor of Savories. He asked them how they had come to be in the service of the princess, and Aurelius offered a highly abridged version of the Exaltation Day massacre. Then Argentus sat them and recommended what he felt were the best things on the menu for someone looking for a single-course experience. Rankle eyed Demi keenly. Hey, Demi, I'd like to snoop around the man's office. I'm going to go to the restroom, and then you call him over and ask him about the best wine pairings. Then I'll slip invisibly into his back office and check for anything suspicious. The plan went fairly flawlessly, with the man going into great detail about each of the wines, and Demi relying on what she had learned from Diyanah to keep the conversation flowing. In the office, Rankle didn't find anything immediately suspicious, but he did notice that in one of the desk cabinets there was a ledger, with details about a number of ingoing and outgoing payments, supplies, and so on. He pocketed the ledger to review in more detail later. Rankle joined them back at the table just as Demi and Aurelius were being served the recommended meals. As he sat down, Rankle was suddenly struck by how delicious smelling the food was. Aurelius also was taken in by the aromas, and he immediately tucked in. It was some of the best food he had ever tasted. Oh, Demi, he said, you've got to try this, it's fantastic. Somehow Demi wasn't quite as taken in as they were. Maybe the synthetic parts of her mind were not responding in quite the same way to the aromas, or maybe something else was going on. She glanced around to make sure Argentus wasn't looking at her, and as discreetly as she could, she cast a detect magic spell. Both Rankle and Aurelius had a recognizable glow about them, the aura of a mind-affecting enchantment spell. Both of you stop eating, she instructed. You are under the effects of a spell right now. They stopped and listened to her. Aurelius, can you do that magical blending thing the School of the Veil taught you, so that no one can detect your spell casting, and then do a targeted dispel on any enchantments placed upon you? Aurelius nodded at her. No sooner had he dispelled the magic, and the aura and the food suddenly smelled utterly mediocre. He took another bite of his food. Not offensively terrible, but certainly nothing exceptional. He looked at Demi. This may be a false lead, he suggested. I'm not sure that he's a cultist or associated with the assassins. I think he's just a common con artist, using some kind of suggestion or charm spell to make the patrons think his food is better than it is. We have his ledger, suggested Rankle. Let's just leave. The 3 of them stood up and started to make their exit. Mr. Argentus rushed out to catch them. Is everything all right? He said. You've barely touched your food. I'm really sorry about that, said Aurelius. We realized we're actually late for an important meeting. It was quite nice, but we must be on our way, and you have guests with reservations coming, I hear. Mr. Argentus nodded and added, Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Of course, I will have to charge you full fare for the food, even though you haven't finished it. Aurelius just handed the money over. He didn't want to pick a fight with the man. They stepped outside, and Rankle began thumbing through the ledger as soon as they had rounded a corner. I wonder how Team Tough are doing, asked Demi. The home of Caradinna Farkin, Moonday, first week of autumn, 4718. A tall but narrow house towered over a weedy yard. The north end of Back Hill was more well kept than the alleys of the Wash, but the homes here were still cheap, and in varying states of disrepair, and this one was especially so. The house's shutters were all closed, but a thin trail of smoke issued from its crooked chimney, an indication someone was home. Thin sheets of metal were nailed to the front door, along with a sign that read, Absolutely no solicitors or psychic manipulators. This looks like the place, said Marius. Any ideas on how to proceed? I would say the straightforward approach seems like the right approach for the tough team, don't you think? Suggested Diyanah. He walked forward and knocked firmly on the door. After a few moments, there were some muffled sounds from inside, and then quiet. Diyanah knocked again, but this time he said, Come on, I can hear you moving around in there. I know you're home, Caradinna. This time a woman's voice addressed him from the inside. Who goes there? Why, it's Diyanah of House Frascati, and I've brought with me some of my family's famous wines. There was quiet on the other side for a moment. Marius gave him a look as if to ask what the heck he was talking about, and Diyanah gave him a look in response that seemed to indicate he had no idea what he was doing. Well, Diyanah, now is not a good time for you. You'll have to come back another day. Marius and Diyanah exchanged another set of awkward and inscrutable looks. Okay, said Diyanah. Well, I need to see you now, as I have something quite urgent to discuss with you. I said it's not a good time. The woman's voice sounded more forceful. Diyanah stepped gingerly towards the door, and then with a sudden push he threw his shoulder into it. There had been a bolted padlock on the wooden door that had been slid to a closed position, but Diyanah's strength was such that the entire portion of the door, upon which the lock was attached, shattered, and the door opened. "What in the hells?" said a dishevelled-looking woman. "You just broke my door." Sorry about that," said Diyanah. "You were acting funny, so I forced myself in, for your security, of course. I have a druid with me," he indicated Anlel in the back of the group. "She can wood-shape your door right back to the way it was, I'm sure. Oh, and these are my friends Marius and Gerda," he added, and indicated the two half-orcs. Caradinna eyed them nervously. Then Diyanah slowly stepped into a room. Caradinna Farkin's house was in disarray, with maps and notes, and frantic ravings covering most of the surfaces. Diyanah observed them. "You've been keeping busy, I see," he said. "Care to tell me what you think is going on in town?" Caradinna looked about to protest, but then she said, "All right, I'll allow you to come in, but only you, and I'll tell you what I know, and then you leave at once." "I'm okay with that," said Diyanah. "Of course, you'll need my friend Anlel the Druid to come in as well, to fix the door." The woman looked out nervously and then said, "Fine, she can come in and fix the door, but she stays by the door, and you and I can speak in the kitchen." "Okay, lead the way," said Diyanah, and he turned to Gerda and Marius. "I guess you guys wait outside for now." Anlel pulled the door closed behind her and began to woodshape it fixed, while Diyanah followed Caradinna into the kitchen. Outside, Gerda began to make her way around the home. "Where are you going?" asked Marius. "I'm looking for another exit, maybe around the back," said Gerda, "just in case things go sideways with Diyanah." "Now that's a good idea," said Marius, and he quietly followed her. Inside, Caradinna sat down with Diyanah, and she nervously poured herself a pot of tea. "Okay, Diyanah," she said. "What do you want to know?" What were you trying to tell the counselors the day before yesterday? They say you were quite certain you knew what was causing the recent rash of strange nightmares folks have been having." Caradinna shook a little awkwardly as she said, "This city is run by a cabal of secret masters. You can know the truth, but you have to have an open mind. You should go to the encircling Bower Theatre. That's where the real truth is hidden." Okay. And what is that truth?" asked Diyanah. "You can't simply be told the truth," she said in a frightened hiss. "You have to see it for yourself." That's not super helpful. Just tell me whatever it is, and I promise I'll believe you," replied Diyanah. Meanwhile, outside, Marius and Gerda had snuck all the way around the building, and had found a back door that seemed to lead into a bedroom. Some of the windows were boarded, and others were dirty, so they couldn't see inside properly. "Door's locked. Where's Rankle when you need him?" muttered Marius. "Rankle's not the only one who can pick a lock," noted Gerda, and she retrieved a set of tools from her belt and began to pick the lock on the back door. "Well, you're not your typical cleric. Honspur doesn't mind a little thieving, I guess," noted Marius. "No, he does not. If someone doesn't keep their belongings on their person, well then, they must not have been very important to them, must they?" she said. Weird religion," muttered Marius, as she finished popping the lock on the back door. Marius and Gerda stealthily moved into the rear room. From the kitchen across the way, they could hear Diyanah talking with Caradinna. He seemed to be getting increasingly frustrated about how circuitous and unspecific she was being, but it wasn't getting him anywhere, as the two of them seemed equally stubborn with each other. Marius looked around the room. Then he saw something close to the bed. It looked like a smear of blood. He leaned down low and looked under the bed. A corpse had been piled here, and his heart jumped when he saw its face. It looked exactly like Caradinna Farkin. The woman that Diyanah was speaking to in the other room must have been some kind of shapeshifter or doppelganger. Marius wasted no time. "It's some kind of shapeshifter," he cried. Diyanah looked up at the woman in surprise. The woman acted faster. A short sword was out of her scabbard as quick as a flash, and in one smooth stroke she had stabbed it into Diyanah's stomach. "Oh, why did I agree to do the talking?" moaned Diyanah as his stomach roared with pain. He tried to hold in his slashed abdomen, and bright red blood was seeping through his fingers. He felt the whole region grow tingly and numb as well. She had poisoned the sword too. He tried to swear at her, but he was slurring his words. The shapeshifter darted out of the kitchen and tried to escape. She would likely have made for the back exit if Gerda and Marius hadn't found it. Instead, she tried to weave around the druid, but Anlel wasn't having it. "I am Oakleaf," she declared, and turned into a large treant, blocking the path between the shapeshifter and her exit. The shapeshifter scanned around the room looking for another exit, but most of the windows had been boarded shut. Marius was on her after that. He delivered his signature knockout punch, throwing a powerful haymaker at the back of her skull, and with a single loud crack, the shapeshifter hit the ground, unconscious. After that, she reverted to her natural form, not a human, but a half-orc, lean and muscular, with dusky green skin. Gerda had reached Diyanah by this time. Honspur might have been an unusual deity, but he did grant the same mastery over life force and vitality that any conventional deity did. She had significant healing powers, and before long she had stopped the spread of the poison, and her curative magic had begun to stitch up the stomach wound. "Oh, let's not tell the others she almost killed me," groaned Diyanah. Speaking of the others, Rankle had cast another sending spell to inform them that they had finished at Savories Restaurant and were headed towards the Backhill neighborhood to meet them near Caradinna's house. Marius replied that they should meet at the home. Another assassin had ambushed them, and they'd need to interrogate her. Diyanah secured the assassin with his iron rope and removed all of her various implements of murder. Meanwhile, as they waited, Marius had been looking over the real Caradinna's various frantic notes about the nightmares. Separating fact from rambling theory proved a little challenging, but Gerda and Anlel started to help, and soon enough they noticed that Caradinna's preeminent opinion was that the dreams were being caused by some monstrous creatures that were hiding in a place called the Sanguine Brothers Slaughterhouse in the meatpacking district. When Aurelius, Demi, and Rankle arrived, it was late in the evening, and the sun was setting in the sky. "Okay, let's wake her up and question her," said Marius. "Wait," said Demi. "She doesn't look too dissimilar from the other assassins that tried to kill the High Priest. We've already done a direct interrogation of one of them, and we learned a little, but perhaps not as much as we could. I'd like to try a different angle here. Let me know what you think." Demi twisted the envoy ring, and suddenly she took the form of a tall man in blue and golden robes. She wore her hood low so as to hide her face, and she illuminated her eyes until they glowed with silver light. "What do you think?" she said in a perfectly disguised masculine voice. "This is what the others described when it came to the Nephilim cult leader." "I like it," said Aurelius. "Definitely worth a shot." "Okay, everyone out of the room," she said. "There's too many of us, but stay close in case of trouble." Then she slapped the half-orc prisoner hard across the face to wake her up. The half-orc looked up, and seeing the Nephilim cult leader standing above her, she suddenly shrieked at the top of her lungs, a genuine fear that was so real that Demi had to take a few steps back. The half-orc assassin was suddenly sobbing. "What are you doing with me?" cried the half-orc. Why did you make me do this?" Demi regained her composure and said in a deep and frightening voice, "You have done well." The half-orc kept crying, and she said, "I just want to leave. I promise I'll forget I ever met you. I don't want any payment. I don't want any more jobs. I just want to go." Demi wasn't quite sure what she was going to get out of this interrogation technique, but terror and tears were not exactly it. She felt she had exhausted this line of inquiry almost as soon as it had begun. She dismissed the disguise and leant down next to her. "I'm sorry I did that to you," she said. "You've obviously been through something quite harrowing. Why don't we start again, and you tell me exactly what was going on?" The half-orc looked aghast at first, and then realized she had been fooled by the very same trick that she had used to trick Diyanah. She suddenly breathed a sigh of relief, but she was still crying. The others filtered in slowly through the doors. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" suggested Demi. The half-orc said her name was Inga Narrowknife. She had been finding work as a mercenary for some time now, and some of her work, of course, was less than savory. Most recently, she and another group of mercenaries had been hired by a man with silver eyes at a tavern called the Grand Uncle, which so far checked out with the other story they had heard as well. However, when she heard the job was a hit on the city's high cleric, Inga decided this wasn't the right job for her. The silver-eyed man had asked her to remain behind after the others had left, though, as he had a different assignment for her that he felt was more suited to her skills. Then, when they were alone, some creatures appeared to crawl out of a rip in the air, a thing of horror with the body of a cockroach and the face of a man. This was the last thing she properly remembered. She remembered a gnawing horror in her gut, and then her mind not being her own. The next thing she knew, she was coming out of a dark reverie covered in blood, and she had murdered this woman in her own home. But she did not recall how she had come here. Marius listened to this, and noted that he had been reviewing the real Caradinna's notes. They had likely killed her for a reason, and all her notes seemed to indicate these monsters were hiding in a slaughterhouse in the meatpacking district. Not the Sanguine Brothers slaughterhouse by any chance, said Rankle. Marius nodded that it was. Interesting. I had been thumbing through the Savories Restaurant ledger, and I found they had purchased a significant amount of suspiciously cheap meat from that slaughterhouse. Oh gods, said Aurelius. Don't tell me we ate something truly disgusting. Yeah, my current working theory is that the Sackles came into town, and then a bunch of the Taldan cavalry went missing. If they were killed, bodies had to go somewhere. Oh, don't say that, said Aurelius. I'm really going to be sick. Ho ho ho! I'm so glad I picked Team Tough right now, said Diyanah, even though I did get stabbed. Okay, serious question though, said Demi. How are we all doing on resources, spells, health, supplies, and so on? If the Sackels are hiding at the slaughterhouse, can we strike it tonight? I'm doing mostly okay on spells, said Aurelius. Enlil and Gerda were as well. Well, the sending spells I've been casting are pretty costly, actually, said Rankle. They will deny me some of my offensive capabilities. Although, as you know, I'm also skilled with the blade, and I have plenty of invisibility left for the day, so I should be okay. But why the rush on doing this tonight? Because tomorrow morning everyone's going to know that the High Priest Palliator has been murdered, and once that comes out, Yanda's going to do everything in his power to blame us for it. That will make our lives more complicated. If it is the Sackels that are hiding in the slaughterhouse, and if they are the things causing the nightmares, then we can fix one of the 4 problems the city is facing on the very first day that we've been in town. That will go a long way towards reducing any suspicion the council might feel towards us. Yeah, this is probably a crazy fight we're getting into, but I actually agree with Demi here, said Aurelius. But our approach needs to be careful, not like our usual cavalier, kick-all-the-doors-down approach. I cast Invisibility Sphere. Demi conceals our sound with silent table spells. We approach through the windows, roof entrances, side doors, whatever. We take things out quietly, one at a time. We also have to figure out how to prevent these things from escaping into the ethereal plane. And we should also decide what we do with her, asked Marius, pointing a thumb at Inga tied to the chair. Simple, said Demi. Inga, you have one chance to make this right. We're going to kill the things that did this to you, okay? You're going to come with us and help us, as scary as that might sound. If you try to run away, we'll kill you, because you're a liability to us on the loose. If you stick with us, though, you should know that we work for Princess Eutropia. We will get you an official pardon for the murder of Caradinna Farkin, and while we're at it, for any past crimes you are later connected to that occurred prior to this moment of meeting us. What do you say? Inga's eyes dried and hardened slightly. I'm not normally much of a heroic type, but given the circumstances, yes, 100 times yes. End of chapter. Thank you so much for watching. You've just watched Season 3, Episode 4 of my Pathfinder 616 War for the Crown series. This episode, the investigation begins, sees our heroes finally beginning to investigate the various ailments that are afflicting the town of Yanmas, hopefully winning over the people and eventually winning the Avon Prefecture for their kind of northern alliance that they've established. This episode starts getting a little more jam-packed. We have so much going on in this episode. They are accosted by townsfolk. They go and speak with the high priest at the temple of Abadar and are then attacked by assassins. They then decide to split the party. Half the party goes to Savories Restaurant to investigate that location, while the other half of the party goes to investigate the home of Caradinna Farkin, a noted conspiracy theorist in town, who maybe has some clues as to what might be going on with the dreams. All of these episodes are kind of fun, individual moments. There's a funny thing about the way that the mechanics of the world relate to kind of our understanding of the reality of the world. And sometimes those line up nicely and sometimes they don't line up so nicely. So one really stark example of this occurred in the course of this session, where Demi cast a sleep spell on essentially some random villagers, some commoners that attacked them in the streets. In the first session ever, there were some thugs at the Exaltation Day Gala, which Demi had put to sleep, I think 4 of them in a single casting of sleep. And here she is now, many levels later, and that spell is essentially not working because these commoners, the book has decided to make them 5 hit dice commoners. And I think and part of that is just the world essentially scales with the players, right? So in order to keep the challenge level up, RPGs do this artificial thing where everything in the world around them suddenly becomes more powerful. So all of a sudden, a villager with a pitchfork is much more dangerous than, a lady in waiting's like thug that she's got, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from the perspective of the world. So I sort of made the decision that I was going to treat those commoners as one-hit dice creatures and allow Demi's sleep spell to affect 4 of them. I only call this out because I think it's the type of ad hoc decision making that as a GM it's sometimes worth doing to retain a sense of verisimilitude or verite, and just to remind GMs out there that they can just break the rules whenever they want, because that's it's a role-playing game, and part of the exercise here is to create a sense of reality. So in a couple levels, Demi will get a deeper slumber spell, which will allow her to affect more creatures. But again, this is one of those spells. I think actually the player that played Demi notes this in the course of the interview that I did that you all saw during my 2-year anniversary special, where basically sleep gets worse and worse as the game progresses. And that's also why you want to make sure that people are retraining spells and discovering new spells along the way. But as sleep was kind of an iconic spell, there were a couple of places where I sort of massaged it so that she was still getting value out of it. Apart from that, I think that was a pretty linear encounter, pretty close to the way it is in the books. I think my group in particular had no problem doing non-lethal damage to essentially innocent victims. I don't know if other groups out there were killing those folks outright, and if that caused problems with the City Watch. But in my particular case, my group pretty much neutralized them, interrogated them, and moved on. The second encounter, also a lot of fun. Interestingly, having those 2 back-to-back did feel a little bit like a repeat. They get ambushed and then immediately they get ambushed again. But fortunately, the villains are quite different. You have villagers that are under some kind of dream thing, and then you have trained assassins that are under an invisibility spell and are much more competent. That particular assassin fight I also didn't render in the video as a battle map. And part of that, and I don't know how I'll handle this in the future, is that was a fight that had a high degree of verticality, which I found fairly easy to represent I have these like stackable tiles that I use to represent something that's flying, or potentially something that they're sort of transparent, that is up in the rafters. And so that was a case where they were in a room in the temple, the assassins were all up in the rafters, and they started to jump down and attack the players, and they were trying to keep the high priest safe. And so that was a really fun, dynamic fight that I ultimately, when editing this video, I was like, I don't know how to do a 3-dimensional engagement. So that doesn't get rendered as a battle map, but that was a pretty cool fight overall. And also, anytime you have players fighting rogues, I think that's fun because they have this like high spike damage output, where if they sort of flank your players, they can be in a bit of trouble. Once again, my party, very well coordinated. The glitter dust revealed them. Diyanah's boots of spider climbing meant that he could engage with them very quickly. And they just have a lot of tricks up their sleeves. So they were doing a good job of keeping the High Cleric safe. He survived the encounter. And then Aurelius had this awesome idea that I love. I feel like Aurelius always has these sneaky spells in his back pocket that I as a GM, I'm not even aware of. Mirror Hideaway in the last session was a great one. In this session, that Sculpt Corpse spell made for a really interesting and I think different conclusion to this encounter than I think a lot of playgroups might get, where they decided they would essentially pretend that the assassins had been successful in their mission, and in so doing they would have an opportunity to get the drop on the figure that hired them, which they have now deduced is Vadrigan Pole, who is kind of our big bad for book 3. He is the head of the Twilight Church, which I think at this point, my viewers hopefully have pieced together that it's clear that this is kind of related to the Immaculate Circle and is probably the organization that's trying to resurrect this Prince Carius. This I thought was an interesting turn of events, and it also meant that there was a specific date. It was 2 days out that they were going to encounter Vadragan Pole, and it gave me a little bit of time to kind of prep for what that encounter would be like when they went to kind of collect the bounty as pretending to be the assassin. So that was kind of cool. And then we had our first party split. Now, you always have to be a little wary if you're planning to split the party. It does mean that if you're doing it at the game table, half the players may be twiddling their thumbs. You really need all the players to be locked into what's happening, even if they're not present. In my particular case, it was a little bit easier because we basically had a couple sessions where not all the players were present back to back. So we had a game session where one player was unavailable, and then another game session where 2 players were unavailable. And so we decided, well, we'll do the restaurant in one session, and we'll do Farkin's house in the other session. And we also have these NPCs now, so if we had a player that's available for both, they can always jump in and inhabit the NPC if needed. So that worked out, I think, really well, and also allowed them to really stick to this accelerated timeline that they had committed themselves to. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. That's all I got for you today. Like, subscribe, do all the fun things, and I'll see you next time.